Hi folks, so this is the gut hormones and cravings information part 2. As promised, I'm going to tell you about your female hormone cycle because a lot of women don't actually know how their body works. Most people have a cycle that's between 24 days and 35 days, and for it to be slightly longer at times and slightly shorter at times is just part of you being female and how it works, so don't panic about that. But we kind of split it up over 4 weeks just to make it easier to sort of talk about it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then also a little bit about why we get the symptoms that we get because of the hormones that are involved. So most of you will be familiar with the main 3 hormones that we think about when we think about our cycle, and they're all called steroid hormones, and they are all made in different areas of the body. So we're looking at progesterone, we're looking at estrogen, we're looking at testosterone. Now I've got a little diagram here, and this is basically showing you what your hormones do in relation to each other in your cycle. Now I have an awful feeling when I show you this it might be slightly backwards, but we'll get the gist of what goes on. So this is week 1 over here. And so what happens is you've got all 3 levels, all 3 of your estrogen, progesterone and testosterone are pretty low. And pretty much all the way along, apart from when we get to the end of week 2 and into week 3, pretty much end of week 2, there's a little elevation there, that's testosterone. And so that is when you are going to be at your best when it comes to strength training, when it comes to competition, when it comes to confidence, and that sort of thing. So that's your best time. If you're an athlete, for example, that's your best time to be doing a competition. So what we've got here is your estrogen is going to raise up, and it keeps on raising at a steady level up until around about day 14, which is ideally when you are going to ovulate. And as you can see at the bottom here, progesterone's not doing a great deal, but it just starts to increase at ovulation, and it then increases once it knows that your body hasn't actually got pregnant. It then is going to decrease its amount. Now can you see that there is a little dip and then an elevation and then another dip of your estrogen? And this is what people don't necessarily understand. They just think, well, one goes up, the other one goes down. It's not quite like that. So what you've got is your estrogen is rising very, very steadily. So what does that mean for you and how you feel and your cravings and stuff? Well, very simply, very much so on around about sort of day 1, day 2, you're probably going to feel a little bit tired. Everything is low. So you're going to feel a bit achy, you're going to be a little bit tired, you're going to be a little bit fatigued. And it's quite normal. Usually around about the 2nd or 3rd day, you start to perk up a bit. Your mood should lift, your energy should lift, you're over the worst pain, and you should start to feel that your libido's increased and you're kind of feeling like you want to socialize, and you're feeling pretty good. Now what happens is, as that estrogen then starts to raise up, it's basically sending a signal to other bits of your body to stimulate the release of follicles. The follicle is the fluid-filled sac which has got the egg inside it, and so there's a particular hormone that gets stimulated to be released so that is getting prepared, and it starts to grow. That's potentially what's going to be turned into a baby should it get fertilized. So whilst that process is going on in your 2nd week, we're going to have an increased slow and steady rise, as it shows here. It's slow and it's steady, and a nice rise of estrogen. Now this is important because estrogen does affect your mood, and so when we are in the first sort of couple of weeks of our cycle, in general we should be sleeping quite well, we should be feeling quite on an even keel, we don't necessarily overreact to things, we're not short-tempered. We should also feel that our energy levels are pretty good. This is a really good time for you to do quite a bit of exercise, things like running, things like HIIT training, in week 1 for sure, and then definitely in week 2. That's the time in week 2 for you to think about increasing your weights and really go into town on building strength, because all of the levels of your hormones are perfect for you to feel good doing that. And what you're also going to find is that you don't really struggle a great deal with controlling your appetite. If anything, your appetite might decrease. And so if you're, for example, following a diet plan where you are reducing calories, you'll probably find that in the sort of second half of week 1 and pretty much most of week 2, you have no problem following it. You're naturally not as hungry, and you're just generally feeling pretty good. This is the best couple of weeks of your cycle. Then what starts to happen is things begin to change as the body then says, right, estrogen has gone high enough for something else to happen. Another hormone steps in, and that's called luteinizing hormone, and that just gets your uterus ready for hanging on to an egg and making that grow. Now, obviously, there's a short period of time, really between kind of day 14 and 16, when that egg that's been released can potentially be fertilized. Now, once that egg has been released, once ovulation happens, that is when progesterone kicks in. So the signal goes to the ovaries and says, right, progesterone, you need to kick in now because you need to get the lining of the uterus ready just in case we need to grow a baby here. Now, this is a good thing as far as most of you are concerned, because that rise in progesterone means that you are still feeling pretty energetic. You've still got that rise in testosterone that's kicked in the latter end of week 2 as well, and a little bit into week 3, just a bit. However, once we get that influx of progesterone and estrogen starts to dip, this is when we can start to find that we might get a bit more tired. So a lot of people think in week 4, that's the time when you're really tired, the week kind of that your period's due sort of at the end of it. No, usually week 3. That is often the worst week for you feeling low energy-wise and just generally. Also when you're feeling a little bit more tired, a little bit less motivated, and unfortunately this is when cravings are going to kick in. Your appetite possibly will increase, it might not, but your cravings probably will. You may also get things like constipation kicking in, or just generally issues going on with your toilet habits, because the progesterone increase is preparing for you to become pregnant, and that means that it's going to be slowing down your digestion a little bit, because it wants to absorb as many of the nutrients, which, remember from the first one, get absorbed down in the lower intestine. It wants to absorb as many of those nutrients as possible, just in case it needs everything for the fact that you might be growing a baby. So it means then that week 3 is probably the trickiest one. So we've got progesterone rising and we've got estrogen dipping, and this is the first dip. So put those things together, this is where you probably find that you tend to overreact to things, your temper isn't great, what was absolutely cool the week before suddenly is not. Now, what we need to take into account when all this is going on is that all of those symptoms are going to be exacerbated by stress, because stress is also going to deplete how your body's feeling and its serotonin levels. Now, what happens with when progesterone comes in is that there is a little bit of a dip in serotonin as well, and it just means that all in all, it's kind of the worst week for you to be starting something new, for you to beginning to socialize, for you to start a new exercise or a new diet program. It's the worst week possible, and this is why it's important that you know your cycle, because if you do, you can structure your lifestyle, your activities, the choices that you make around that, and choose times where it's going to be easier for you to implement new things and start socializing and stuff, rather than choosing times when it's going to be significantly harder. And if you don't know your cycle, start keeping a diary, because the more you do know it, the easier you're going to manage this stuff. So what we then have got going on is in week 2, we've got if you're not pregnant, obviously, then we're going to get ready to release that egg. So progesterone's still being released, but the amount is going to be decreased. And now there's a little rise in estrogen before it starts to fall again. So towards the end of week 3 and the beginning of week 4, you're probably feeling a little bit better again, to be quite honest. But on that second dip, this is where your cravings will kick in. And when that estrogen starts to fall for the second time, it's going to drag down serotonin. Now we know from the last video that when you are under stress, your body is going to push you towards foods that increase your blood sugar levels, because when insulin comes in, it means that serotonin is going to be elevated. And your body wants that serotonin to be elevated because the estrogen, or the lack of estrogen, is bringing it down as well. So if you're stressed and you're in that 4th week of your period, those things together are going to be pushing you towards those refined carbohydrate foods, the ones that act fast and turn into sugar in your body. And so this is why you tend to find cravings are the worst at the latter end. For some people, week 3, for some people, week 4, for some people, it's exaggerated like a couple of days before their period. And so this is all to do with your cycle. Now, estrogen is also responsible for quite a few things, and it's really important that we understand a little bit about what else it does apart from that cycle. It does affect your mood. It affects anxiety. It affects depression a lot. When you're in the sort of second week, but I'd say sort of day 10 to day 14 of your cycle, that's probably when you're feeling at your best, because we've got that little rise going on, which means you're probably sleeping well, your anxiety levels are not too bad. If it goes too high, it can affect your sleep, and if it drops too low, it can also affect your sleep. Same with anxiety, same with depression. We can get very similar symptoms when the levels are too high as when they're too low. So one is not necessarily, this means it's high, that means it's low. Not necessarily, we're all different. And I think you're beginning to realise that with a lot of this stuff that I'm talking about. I can generalise, but you are all going to have slightly different experiences with your own hormone fluctuations, and it depends on what is the normal for you, and what is high for you and what is low for you. But estrogen also affects your thyroid. Now, it decreases thyroid function. So as your estrogen is rising, your thyroid function can decrease a little bit. It also increases something called thyroid binding globulin. Now, what that does is it kind of stops the thyroid from working efficiently and effectively, which then decreases your metabolism, which means that you store fat more easily. Now, this is kind of when we get women saying, well, my body's working against me. Well, actually, it's not. It's designed to do that because if you get pregnant, you want to have those fat stores available. Now, don't forget, our body evolved for us to survive in times of feast and famine, not in the 21st century when we are surrounded by copious amounts of food. So that is why the body does what it does, because that's how it evolved. Your mechanism, your 3 brains, reptilian brain, mammalian brain, and then your human brain on top, that reptilian brain is designed for you to survive no matter what, and your hormonal system and everything that goes on is also designed for that. So that is why that happens. Now, the good news is that when progesterone starts to come in, it reverses that. If there is no pregnancy taking place, it will then increase thyroid function. It will decrease the thyroid binding globulin so that your metabolism goes up again. So a lot of people will find that at the start of week 3, they're feeling pretty good and their metabolism's revving away and all is good. What obviously happens though if you're in perimenopause is that you're not getting the same up and down cycle, because you're not getting the rise in estrogen, you're not getting the rise in progesterone, because progesterone's only triggered by ovulation. So if you're not ovulating, then obviously you're not getting that progesterone trigger. And this is why when it comes to things like HRT and the estrogen being replaced, there are 3 different estrogens, and so it needs to be the one that is the right one for you that's being replaced. So you need to have a test done to see what your levels are of all 3. But also progesterone is sometimes not even mentioned, and testosterone isn't either, and testosterone is also an important part of this whole cycle. So for many of you who have got problems with not sleeping, and you are anxious a lot of the time, and you feel that you could just, those mood changes are really, really strange, you don't recognize yourself when you're in perimenopause, it's oftentimes not just because the estrogen is not rising like it did, but it's because the progesterone isn't rising like it did either. Now, progesterone's important for bone health. Estrogen, too much of it is not great, because it can mean that we have got more brittle bones and they break more easily. But progesterone also is vital for us growing new bones. So both of them are absolutely important, and we can get now hormone creams and things like that that will help. Very much depends on your GP, and very much depends on where exactly are your hormone levels. If you're just going to your GP with issues of hot flushes and stuff, and they suddenly say to you, well, you know, do you want to try HRT? Ask them no. First, can you just take a blood test and tell me exactly what my levels are doing of all 3 of those estrogens? What is aldosterone doing? What are my DHEA levels doing? What is going on with testosterone as well as progesterone? You want to know all of that stuff before you make your mind up, because if you increase more of one hormone, there's going to be a knock-on effect on the other ones. So you're still not necessarily going to feel massively better. You will do initially, by the way. You will do. It'll probably last for a month to 3 months before you then start to find that the symptoms creep back in. Now, I'm being very general. That's not the case for everybody. And HRT, some women absolutely swear by it because it's the right estrogen for them, and they get the balance right pretty much from the off. Now, oftentimes that's more through luck than through management. But you can go to a functional nutritional practitioner who will help you look at alternatives like progesterone creams and that kind of thing. So the key to remember to all of this is that the food choices that you're going to be pushed towards when your estrogen's dropping because your body is crying out for serotonin is going to push you towards those high sugar foods. Now, refined floury foods, high sugar foods, sweets, cakes, biscuits, pastas, waffles, etc., all of those things are the ones you're going to go for because they work the fastest. You can still get a natural high in serotonin from other foods, which are your starchy carbohydrates. So things like jacket potatoes and rice and stuff like that are absolutely fine, comforting foods. And they will steadily increase the blood sugar levels, not make it have a massive sharp rise and a dip. Also, we can look at protein foods which help as well. So things like chicken and turkey and foods that have the precursor to serotonin in them called tryptophan are also going to help. So the most important thing for you to take on board is that knowing your cycle is going to help you to control cravings, there's no doubt about it. But managing your stress is going to be crucial right across the board. So be kind to yourself and notice when you start to feel that you're overreacting, when you suddenly start not to be able to sleep as well, when your core temperature is changing, you know that it's to do with the rise in progesterone, the dip in estrogen, or if you're perimenopausal, it's because you're not having those same effects. So you need to look at very much more so what foods can help you. Exercise, what exercise are you doing to help you increase naturally the progesterone and the testosterone in your own body, because you can do it. And that's what I'm going to cover a little bit later on. But the next one, I'm going to look at a bit more depth your microbiome and why that leads you to certain foods and the effect that that has on your serotonin and your immune system, because that is all in your gut. So when I'm talking about the serotonin levels, we make 70% of the serotonin in our gut. So it's really important for you to take on board that what you put into your gut is also going to affect that serotonin production. And it's that your body is trying to get to make you feel less anxious, calmer, to be able to cope and to also do all of the other things that it helps you to do. And I'm going to leave you with one last thing. Above this video, I'm going to put a little list of things that are to do with having an over-dominance of estrogen, because although I said to you estrogen, it feels good and we don't want it to drop too low, what a lot of us have is a dominance of specifically one estrogen, sometimes two. And that list is going to give you an idea of what the signs of estrogen dominance are. Now, this is again to do with what you're eating, because unfortunately for us, we live in a world where convenience food and supermarkets are the norm for most of us. And to mass produce certain crops and a lot of animal foods, then they use artificial hormones. So we are getting hormones and estrogens from the food that we eat, which means we're getting more than we would normally have just from our own body's process. And over time, that's going to increase. So it also means that you're going to put on weight a little bit more easily, and fat itself produces estrogen. So I've put that above here, and I would suggest you kind of read through that a couple of times so that it makes sense and you actually understand why we want to avoid certain foods if we can, purely and simply from that over dominance of estrogen point of view. Now, I'm not saying that everybody's got estrogen dominance. Depends on how good your body is at getting rid of it. But if you are somebody who suffers a lot from constipation, remember what I said about your body not being able to get rid of the stuff, it then reabsorbs it and has to recycle it. It means that you will be reabsorbing and recycling some of the waste hormones from your cycle, which we don't really want. Any questions as before, please do pop them underneath here, or any comments. I know it's quite a long one, it's 22 minutes long, folks, but it is worth a listen if you are somebody who is confused as to what is going on with your moods, with your cravings, and why you feel that your weight is completely out of control. I hope it helps. Let me know. Bye.